And so I was doing my first Friday night high school live shot, which was a big deal in Alabama. And I'm sitting there, George, having a moment like, I did it and I made it and I'm making $10,500. I wish I knew what that was in pounds. I'm, making all this money and look at me. And I'm having this wonderful moment of confidence. And as I'm in the middle of that, I see the coach and a couple of other men walking, and the coach I'm waiting for is holding a basketball and a football. And I just didn't think anything of it. I noticed it and I went to like awkwardly shake his hand. And the first thing he said to me, I wish I could do a good Southern accent, but he said, "Little girl, I just wanted you to know the difference between a football and a basketball. And a basketball is round and a football is oblong."
Welcome back to another episode of Georgeonsports with me, your host, George. Joining us on today's show is none other than Laura Okmin, NFL reporter for Fox and also Westwood One. Thank you for coming on the show, and how are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm wonderful. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. So thank you for having me across the pond.
You are more than welcome. Just like yourself, I'm really excited for this one. So I'm going to get straight in because I can't wait to hear what you've got to say. And we're going to start with you, all about you, Laura. Taking it back to what inspired you to even pursue a career in sports and broadcasting in the first place?
It's funny because I look back and go 30 years ago, there was so much that inspired me, but what in the world inspired me and allowed me and my lack of confidence to even think that I had a place at the table when everyone kept telling me there was no room for me. I look back at that young woman 30 years ago who was starting out in this business, and I can't believe that because it feels like a different person, that she was able to have the voice and have the confidence to say, I do, because now I do. That's an easy conversation for me now. But back then, I always knew I wanted to be a storyteller. I always knew journalism. And I took my first sports class in college and I fell in love with it. I was the only girl in the class. And as soon as I went, these are the best stories to tell. There's no better story than these athletes and these games and what they're going through. And this is where I want to be. I was told immediately when I figured that out, we don't want you. This would be a very hard industry for you to break into. So you better have a plan B and a plan C. And what inspired me was just my love of sports, my love of storytelling, and thank God, a little kernel of don't listen to everybody else's voice, listen to your own, and let's do this. And that's harder and harder, I think, for all of these young women getting into this business, because back then, George, there was no social media. So a couple people told me that, and that felt very loud, but now there's millions of people telling you you're not good enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not thin enough. So it was hard then, but it's even harder now to me with all the things that young men and young women have to go through when they are trying to figure out their dream.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on what I was going to ask you next. You mentioned you were the only girl in the room back when you were in school. And I know you went on to get a degree in journalism. So in terms of challenges, you've mentioned some already. Would you say they were some of the most prevalent challenges that you perhaps faced up and coming in the industry of sports and media, being a female and a woman too?
I feel like I could write a book and every chapter have another story. And it's interesting because I have an organization for women in sports, and I do 5 of these boot camps every year. And I have to think of a story that I haven't told because so many of them have been to many of them. What can I tell about what I've gone through? What adversity have I gone through? And George, I never run out of stories. So I'm always like, well, 10 years later, you would think I'd be like, that's all I've gone through. But any woman would tell you, or any man or woman of color would tell you, that when you're in an industry or in a room where you are the only person that looks like you, there's always stories of what you've had to overcome and what how you've grown your backbone and your confidence bone, I guess, your confidence muscle. And what I would tell you is every step of the way, there was another challenge. It took me 9 months to get my first job, which was a long time, but I just was like, everyone kept saying, what's your plan B? And I kept saying, to make sure my plan A works. So everyone kept telling me, listen to all these rejections, you're not going to make it in sports. Thankfully, I kept going for plan A. And I finally got my job in Montgomery, Alabama, which is, very deep south in America. And I had never been that deep south before. And I finally got my first job, and I was about to do a Friday night football live shot. And I didn't know growing up in the Midwest of America that in the Deep South, Friday night football is as big as Sunday football was for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so American football. And so I was doing my first Friday night high school live shot, which was a big deal in Alabama. And I'm sitting there, George, having a moment like, I did it and I made it and I'm making $10,500. I wish I knew what that was in pounds. I'm, making all this money and look at me. And I'm having this wonderful moment of confidence. And as I'm in the middle of that, I see the coach and a couple of other men walking, and the coach I'm waiting for is holding a basketball and a football. And I just didn't think anything of it. I noticed it and I went to like awkwardly shake his hand. And the first thing he said to me, I wish I could do a good Southern accent, but he said, "Little girl, I just wanted you to know the difference between a football and a basketball. And a
Wow.
basketball is round and a football is oblong." And I went from having this moment of confidence to feeling crushed and deflated and defeated and thinking, I haven't accomplished anything. And who am I to think that I know what I'm doing? Nobody wants me here. So even the moments of like, oh, that feels good, something would happen so quickly to have another voice in my head going, hold on a second. If you think you've made it or if you think you're on the right path, think again. So there were a whole bunch of those stories, that litter my trajectory in 30 years in this industry.
And with that, you mentioned not having the confidence previously and having the confidence now because of what you've experienced. And because of that, you're very well known for your outstanding NFL work, but not only that, NBA, baseball. But what makes football, American football, such a beloved sport in the US? Because we know how serious fans take the sport, cities take the sport, states take the sport. What gives it that vibe and that community feel?
It's funny because I have covered pretty much everything. And whenever I'm in that sport, I would always be, if someone would say, what's your favorite to cover? I'd say whichever one I was in. And I meant that because whatever moment you're in, whatever sport or athlete you're talking to, it's the wonderful moment. It's the most wonderful moment at that time. American football is different. The passion around it, the fever around it. I mean that in a good way and in a bad way. And I do think there's something also to not just the sport that people love, but I think the athletes figured it out probably before most about making sure that they were known underneath the helmets and being able to not just root for the Green Bay Packers, but Aaron Rodgers' story or Patrick Mahomes' story. And I think football does a fantastic job. It's not necessarily the league, it's more the individuals, but I think the players have done such a great job in making sure that their stories are known. So not only do we glob on to the sport, but I also think there's something to the incredible warriors that, and this, I mean, you played. So the incredible warriors of what you have to overcome, what your bodies do, what your brain does, what your mind is able to do. And I just think there's something special. I predominantly covered the NFL now, and that's been about 10 years where I said, I'd rather cover one and really focus on building relationships instead of bopping around all the time. And I just know that I've never loved covering a sport and the humans more. And I have a complicated relationship with football as I see it do so many things to bodies of people I care about. And yet I love the people who make up the sport so much. And there's just a different joy there to me than any of the other sports that I covered.
And on the path of meeting different athletes and different people, you've obviously interviewed and spoken to so many athletes and different coaches along the way too. But is there someone in particular, be it an athlete or a coach, that you've interviewed or spoken to that stands out or was impactful to you that comes to the forefront of your mind?
I mean this, I hate when I give this answer, but there's too many for me to count. Like they're really, I want to say some old school players who I loved getting to know, the Brian Urlachers and the Steve Smiths and the players, that helped me learn how to build relationships because they were so hard to build relationships with. So I'm really grateful for the players that took me. Brian Urlacher calls it his bubble. You can't get in the bubble. And every time I would see Brian or talk to Brian, I'd be like, I'm getting in the bubble. And he'd be like, don't try to get in the bubble. No media in the bubble. And for 3 years, I was like, I'm getting in the bubble. And then finally one day I did. And now this organization for women in sports, I have this daughter, Pamela, who is one of my greatest galvanizers. So I have so many players that help teach me lessons of how to build relationships that I really, really appreciate. But also, like nowadays, Tyrann Mathieu and Aaron Donald and Mike McCarthy, the Cowboys head coach, and Dan
Yeah.
Quinn, the Cowboys defensive coordinator, the men that I get to know who are so vulnerable and share their stories, and for the coaches, for Mike and Dan, share their families. And Aaron and Tyrann, talking to them about what masculinity looks like and leadership looks like, and watching how shy and closed off they were early on to now being two of the most incredible leaders on their team and in the league, and being able to be along for their journey and talking to them about it was really special. And make a long answer longer, one of the really cool things for me, what I would also say, what stands out, I cut my teeth with Michael Jordan and the Bulls when I was a young reporter. And so Michael and Charles Barkley gave me the most important lessons I ever learned. Michael taught me about, one time I was kind of stalking and waiting for him. I knew where he would go from parking at the United Center to where the locker room was. And you had about 65 seconds to walk with him and talk. And I was waiting and stalking, and he came out, and all of a sudden I ran and was like, Michael, because I needed something. And he just
Yeah.
stopped and he like did that to me. And he said, Laura, hi, how are you? Great day. How are you? And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And he said, no big deal. Like, I know people think that they only have a few seconds with me, but say hello. So that was really important for me to learn, which was, I'm talking to humans, not contacts and not sources. And now I would never start a conversation without truly asking how somebody is. And one time I called Charles Barkley, and he answered the phone, and he said, well, Laura Okmin, what do you need? And I said, can a girl just call and say hello? And he said, a girl can, you just never do. I'm not trying to give you grief, just you call when you need something. What do you need? And George, that hit me in the heart, because I didn't ever want to be that person who someone looked at and was like, ugh, it's her again. So that sent me on this whole new direction, which was, how do I build relationships? How do I make sure I'm not using people? And how do I make sure that people look forward to seeing me and talking to me? And I don't know if I would have learned that lesson if it wasn't for Michael and Charles telling me to slow down, stop thinking like a reporter, and start thinking like a human.
I love that, because it always reminded you, and it reminds everybody in this kind of field, of the human element to what we do, which is obviously really important. Take me back to meeting Kobe Bryant.
It was such an interesting day. And I would have said this without the prism of now looking back. I met Kobe. We had a one-on-one interview scheduled with him. I was with Fox Sports, and we were covering the Olympics, and it was the London Olympics. And we were waiting in a room to talk to Kobe, and Kobe did not do many one-on-ones, so it was a big deal. And he hadn't yet spoken about the Olympic experience. I think they were just coming from opening ceremonies. And I was really excited for a lot of reasons to meet Kobe, but one of them was because I knew how much he studied Michael. And so, as someone who followed Michael for years, I could see in the ways he studied his press conferences, and I could see the ways that he he patterned himself after Michael. But one of the things that I loved about Michael was, when I teach this to women about Michael Jordaning the room, when you walk in a room and you take the room and it's yours. And as a journalist, I have to take the room, because if I'm doing an interview with you and you don't trust me, or you're commanding the room, I can't get you to where I need to get you, and I can't make you comfortable. So of all these years of taking the room, Michael would never let me take the room. And that used to drive me crazy. And then I one day understood, let Michael Jordan take the room. And so selfishly, I was really looking forward to if Kobe would fight for the room. And so we waited in the room, a tiny room we were waiting for in the hotel, and it was hours, and they were late, and Kobe was late, and we were starting to think it wasn't going to happen. And I was so frustrated. We were all frustrated because, it was a whole day waiting on Kobe. And Kobe walked in the room and could not have been more gracious, and gave up the room in 2 seconds of like, can I trust you? Do you got this room? Got it. And just went. And it was one of my favorite interviews I've ever done because it was Kobe in this wonderful time of life. We had just seen him at the opening ceremonies and he looked like he was having more fun than anybody. And we hadn't seen that side because basketball was so serious to him. And he just came in with so many comparisons. And so I think there was such a wall up with Kobe. And it just at the opening ceremonies, it looked like he was a kid. So I asked him about that and said, I don't think I've ever seen you have more fun publicly. And he said, I feel like this is my college experience because he didn't have one. And so it was him talking about the dorm rooms and the meeting
Yeah.
everybody and just having this lovely time in his life. And that's pretty cool to have Kobe be Kobe at that time and yet still feel like you were talking to somebody with a whole fresh set of eyes. And his wall was so down because he was so excited about sharing the experience. So it's one of my favorite interviews, and I would have said that before he passed away, but obviously now that there's a little more in my heart with it. But that whole room, even though he gave up the room, what I would tell you is he owned
Yeah.
the room because the whole crew, everybody fell in love with him. He was so wonderful and gracious.
Laura, you've covered over 10 Super Bowls, 2 Olympics, NBA finals, and more. Knowing how, you spoke about back in the day, you necessarily didn't have the confidence, but obviously where you're sitting now is, a very great position. Looking back at the journey, also knowing that you are the third longest tenured sideline reporter in NFL history, which is absolutely amazing. What does that feel like to you to look back at that journey and, from where you were to where you are now? What does that feel like?
It's finally, for the first time, all the voices in my head have gone away and it's just mine. And after all these years of being told nobody wants you, nobody cares about you, no one wants to hear what you say, all of that, finally to look around and see how, not just that I'm in this industry, but how long I've made it in this
Yeah.
industry. It's a great feeling. And I think what I'm most proud of is that when I was in my 20s or probably my 30s, I never saw women over 40 who were still on camera and who were still, who were still doing it. And I love the fact that now over 50, that the young women I hope to inspire and the young women of Galvanize, my organization, I want them to see women over 40 and women over 50 crushing it and still in it and showing them it gets better, that relationships get deeper, trust gets better, that now players introduce themselves to me, so things like that I would have never imagined. And so really I'm so proud. I'm proud of myself and I'm proud of who I've become because I think for so long all you're worrying about is can I make it? Can I make it? And then one day you look around and go, I kind of did. I think I'm here. And the cool part thing is, George, where I love that I'm still doing what I love to do. And I could have probably predicted that, if I've got the work ethic, I've got the drive, I hope I'm doing this. But the things that I never expected and the ways that I opened up my eyes and opened up my heart to new opportunities and new experiences and doing things I never saw coming. That's pretty cool. And also to be sitting here at this age and never been happier and never been more fulfilled and more challenged, more in love with my husband, with my opportunities, with my world. I think I'm most proud of that is after all these years as a young woman hearing that it goes downhill after a certain age. I hope every day that I show that it only gets better and better.
And with that great segue, my next point, which I can't wait to talk to you about, is Galvanize, which you've mentioned a number of times already. And I think obviously you cover sports, but what you do is bigger than sports in terms of empowering women. You talk about you used to take photos with the players and now you're taking photos of all the powerful ladies that you meet in all the different sports that you come across, the sisterhood, the all-female cable team that I think Mike works with on the sidelines too, and just life itself. So talk to me about Galvanize and about how you strive to empower women of all ages to do the things that sometimes they think they can't do, but they really can.
I think you wind up creating what you wish you had. And I just never had women in my life. And I had a lot of mean girls growing up, so I didn't trust girls and hung out with the boys, and very much always said I'm a guy's girl. And that continued when I got into sports. So it was so easy for me to always be around the men because that was my life. And I just know that I didn't have any women peers that I was friends with. I certainly didn't have a woman mentor. And I I look back at that time and go, gosh, that would have helped so much. It would have prevented a lot of mistakes I made. All my friends were guys who gave me sometimes very good advice, but sometimes not such good advice. And I I don't think, and I didn't realize how much I was missing because I never had a lot of women in my life until I started watching all these young women getting thrown into this industry and getting thrown higher than I did and faster than I did. And luckily it happened when I was 40. So I was more motherly than more judgmental. So I really started going, how can I help? How can I make it better for the next waves of women coming in than it was for me? And this job is very selfish. I'm very passionate about it, always have been, but it's a very selfish job. And I love it and I have passion, but I just had no purpose. So back around around 10 years ago when I started it, I also was very sad and very depressed and had a cool job and checked a lot of boxes of really cool things I was doing and people I was meeting. But I was very lonely and I didn't have an army of women around me. I didn't have any women around me, and I didn't want to look like I was complaining, so I didn't share it with anybody. And so I did the work on myself, and part of that really was asking, how can I help people? How can I make this industry better? And Galvanize started with 20 women in a conference room, and now it's over 10 years and over 5,000 women, and we are all over sports. We are all ages, every stage, and I love it. I love having an incredible army of women around me. And I can't believe all these years I wasted thinking that I wasn't a girl's girl, because I've been all along. I just didn't know it. And if I can if I can give all of these women something I didn't have, give them a mentor, give them a group of women to support and be supported by, then hopefully I've made it a little bit better than when I came in.
And with that, what piece of advice would you give to any aspiring sports broadcaster, in particular women or members of underrepresented groups?
That's a whole different podcast, right? That's a whole different conversation because there's so much. But really, I love that you said that, because this is nothing to do. I mean, honestly, this is nothing to do with gender or ethnicity or anything. This is just to do with young people coming in right now, period. There feels like there's such a different pressure now to make it, because everyone's looking at everyone else and thinking they made it. And I know that I have 2 days of workshops with Galvanize, and the first day I have all the women come, and I always say the rule is sweatpants and leggings and no makeup and ponytails and buns. I want you all to meet each other like who you are, not who you want to be on Instagram. And so I have a room of incredible women. Let's say there's 25 women, and they're all looking at each other because they see each other's Instagrams and go, she has it going on. She's made it. And then suddenly they're stripped down in a room saying how sad and lonely they are and living a totally different life. And so I think my biggest advice right now for just young people, period, is understanding that there is no there. There is a here. And it's a coach saying that I just love, just being where your feet are and not worrying about next year or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but right now, what are you doing to make sure that this dream comes true? Right now, what are you doing to make yourself happy? What are you doing in this moment here to make sure that you're doing the work? And I just always, every time someone says, I had 3 calls today, George, and they all kept talking about, well, what about 2 years from now? What about the second job? And I was like, let's just focus on this first job. Let's focus right here and where you are. And I think it's a different way of saying, being Zen. But I think in this industry that's so hard, it's making sure your voice is your own voice, not listening to anyone else telling you you don't belong. And also going to underrepresented groups. I can't say this enough. there, when I first started out, I would go to a Super Bowl or an Olympics and I would count women because I could. So I
Yeah.
would be like, for the first few years, it was I could count women on one hand. Then I could do two hands. Now I can't count because there's so many women. There's so many men or women of color. I can't count them anymore. But you and I can count how many women, how many men and women of color, how many people we see who look like that at the top.
Yeah.
And there's not many. We're back to one hand.
Yeah.
So one of my biggest things I try to always say is also look at other positions in this industry. Don't just go for, holding the microphone on the sideline, even though I love it. Don't just look at the front facing jobs that we see. Go to hire those people. So if I was going to get into this industry now, I'd be trying my best to make sure that I was going up that ladder and making sure I could hire people that look like you and me.
Amazing. Amazing. I mean, what a way to put it. And with that, Laura, before we start to wrap things up, I ask you this. Years from now, we have a scenario where there's a little girl talking to her mum, and she's wanting to be involved in sports broadcasting or broadcasting as a whole. And the mum mentions Laura Okmin. What is it you'd want the mum to say to her little daughter about you? Now, you might recognize the way I phrase that question because it's a question you like to ask legends when you meet them. So, we flip the script and now it's your turn to answer the question.
Oh, I love that you asked. And it is my favorite question to ask because it's always the most wonderful answers. And now I'm going to fail miserably going, oh my gosh, I don't know. I've never thought about it myself. I did ask Kobe that. I've asked Cal Ripken that, Jordan that. So that usually is that's my GOAT question. But what I would hope is that somebody would say that she built a great career and would want that little girl to see that. But I hope more importantly, what she would say is what she did that you didn't see on camera to make it better for generations of young girls and women who came after her. And I hope she would say, I hope that's the way that you will be thinking as you enter the store that her and so many other women helped open for her. I hope that it has nothing to do with me being on TV or my job. I hope it's because I've tried to make it a little bit better for other people.
And with that brings us to the end of the show. I'm almost speechless. That was an amazing episode and more. I can't thank you enough for coming on. I'm almost lost for words, really. Thank you for taking the time out to come on. I'm sure the listeners and the viewers are going to really enjoy that one as much as I have. It's not every day you get to speak to someone with, the bank of knowledge across so many different sports and everything that you have done to help women in the game and to help everybody. I mean, you mentioned so much about people who are starting out now and to try and stay grounded and not to compare yourselves to others and look too far ahead. But thank you again for coming on the show. Guys, Laura Okmin, she's done so much for the game. Fox Sports, what is it? It's Westwood One, third longest tenured NFL sideline reporter in history. You can't really ask for much more than that. So, Laura, thank you for coming on the show once again. Until next time, I've been George from Georgeonsports with Laura Okmin here, and I hope you enjoy that one, and we'll see you on the next one.